So if we'll go back to Alchi and just look at the teacher depictions that we'll find in the Dukang and the Sumtsek, or more broadly across the Alchi monuments, again, we see a big shift from this Dukang depiction to this Sumtsek depiction. Yeah, the Dukang donor depiction, or part of the Dukang donor depiction, is essentially the monastic assembly of Alchi at that time, headed by Kalyan Sherab, who is represented frontally and teaching. And of course, you have the lay followers on the level underneath. And in between is one of those inscriptions that identifies Kalyan Sherab as the founder of the monument. And that is starkly different from the representation in the Sumtsek on the gallery level, where we have one of the earliest, essentially, lineage representations, now specifically to the Drigong school and specifically ending with Pakmotupa and Drigungpa as the last two teachers. And we'll talk, of course, how that comes about. But Drigungpa himself, or if we look at the teacher representations, what is remarkable in addition to the earlier representation is that the monastic dress is different. It's essentially Central Tibetan monastic dress now, in contrast to the one that Kalyan Sherab and the other monks wear. They also wear boots. Our teachers here don't wear boots anymore. And all the gestures that the lamas make are gestures that the Buddha makes. And their skin color is white. Essentially, they're painted white. And of course, that is also the characteristic of Drigungpa, as he is represented in the Great Stupa. And it's in the Great Stupa inscription that it is very explicitly said that the teacher represented here, Drigungpa, is the superior son of the Buddhas of the three times. And actually, this goes back to this saying, or in Drigong literature later on, there is even a saying that Drigungpa himself said that he is the teacher of the Buddha of the three times, rather than just being the son of. So it links very well up with that notion as well. And the small stupa representation, the Tashigomang stupa representation, then makes completely clear that in the composition that Drigungpa is represented within, that he now takes the position of a Buddha between two bodhisattvas, despite the fact that you have a transmission lineage on top and Mahasiddhas at the side. And it is the Mahasiddhas that probably provided the background, so to speak, for a teacher being considered and promoting himself as an awakened being. Yeah, and I think that's partially what I want to focus the talk today on. And so it's no accident that the Mahasiddhas are represented in the Sumtsek as well, that all the 84 Mahasiddhas, for more or less following the Vajradhatu Sri set, ended with Padamba Sangye, who is in the bottom center of the Manjushri Dhoti. And he, in my opinion, stands for the transmission of the esoteric Buddhist teachings to Tibet, but also maybe by extension, one could also read it as, a current awakened being that is represented here. And it's no accident that the same teacher is represented again in both stupas that I just showed, just opposite Trigungpa. Yeah, I had long problems essentially identifying this Mahasiddha as Padampa Sangye because I couldn't actually find a link in the literature on Trigungpa where that would explain his representation there. But I think if one sees him in this kind of larger role as he is depicted also in the Shangrung Cherten, then I think this link of the Mahasiddha tradition to Tibet is sufficient for his repeated representation throughout the Alchi monuments. And so I think that's an important aspect that forms the background of that notion. And why do I think it's important? I think it's important because it is, again, a key or a point of a major transition in the perception and specifically in the public presentation of the teacher within the Tibetan context that is clearly a Tibetan invention, but then becomes a standard within the Tibetan tradition. And so I think that's the main focus. To demonstrate that, we of course have to look at how is the teacher represented before, but there are very few representations outside, the teacher being represented in assemblies like in the Dukang, like Kalden Sherab in the Dukang. One good example is this Maitreya representation of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you do have teachers at the very top that are actually quite similar with this in terms of the monastic dress that we'll saw in the Alchi representation, and similar also in the sense that like Kalden Sherab, they do wear hats and boots besides the monastic dress, which is of course what distinguishes him from the monks that are in the teacher depiction. It's also remarkable that the local monks of Alchi also don't wear the usual lower vest, the sleeveless vest that becomes characteristic for the Tibetan teacher representation. You may be wondering if, I think most of you will be familiar with this painting, why I call it Maitreya, not Amidaios, as I think the Met still does. It's simply the attribute in the hand is a flask rather than a vase. Yeah, and that's, I think, the main reason. And it's the bejeweled flask that he holds, and of course that also explains why he is not red, as one would expect. Was there a question? No. So most of there are very few paintings you can actually kind of date or that actually predate, portable paintings that actually predate Alchi in principle. Yeah, I say to all my students, if you read about the Tibetan painting that it's 11th century, don't trust it, check it. Yeah, there seems to be no strong tradition of Tanka paintings, or the Tankas were so poor that they essentially were replaced, or whatever the reason may be, but there are not too many early pieces. And even those that were published as 11th century, like this one, Chenga Tultimbar, were published so on the basis of the identification of the teacher, who is identified in the back of the painting. but it's contradicted by the C14 dating that the mat has of the canvas. It's painted on, and as you can see here, it's 1160 to 1292. And so a late 12th century date is the earliest you can go with in the case of this painting as well. And it's, yeah, that's kind of a frequent occurrence. And actually, I think unusual teacher representations, unusual teacher locations, as is the case here, are probably a better indicator for an early painting, or a good indicator for an early painting. But what is the case in the depiction of this Kadampa tradition teacher is that he is not that he is not shown as a Buddha. He's shown as an able practitioner. He holds the rosary, and he is clearly related to that tradition of the dialogue between Manjushri and Maitreya, as it is also depicted in Dratang. And so it's a rather conservative teacher depiction at the time. Another kind of teacher depiction that occurs in Alchi brings in the esoteric Buddhist practitioner. Yeah, and in Alchi they play a minor role, but in general, or more broadly, they play a minor role, or they play a minor role in the artistic depictions, but you find them occasionally in India, that you have deities represented with the tantric practitioner in the corner, in this case, or in almost all cases, just holding Vajra and bell in the manner of Vajrasattva, or in some manner that relates to Vajrasattva. I think in this case, we may also assume that there is some kind of ground similar to what, how you imagine a Vajracharya in the Tibetan tradition, or in the Nepalese tradition. And of course, there's this nice article by Gina Kim and Rob Linworth that talks about this relationship of tantric practitioner depictions in their cross-identification with Vajrasattva as it is represented in India, some early works in Dunhuang as well. And they use this particular Vajrasattva Mandala assembly as an example. So this is just a 5-deity assembly of Vajrasattva surrounded by the four offering goddesses. I think there must be the inner offering goddesses. And at the very bottom of it, so here you have Vajrasattva, the central figure with the Vajra held in front of the chest, the bell at the hip, as is most commonly the case in the depictions. And underneath you have a practitioner who also holds a Vajra in the hand. It could also just work, actually by location, it should be the top of the bell in this case. But they bring other examples as well. And so there is this, or at least this occasional depiction of actually esoteric Buddhist practitioners that is found in early paintings. The Vajradhatu Mandala that I showed in the first lecture, that is probably early, also we can't really date it, is another example in that respect, because if we look in the lower corner, we'll have 5 Tibetans represented, and the one in the blue dress, you'll see the big Vajra, and I assume that the second hand is supposed to hold a bell, but at least the Vajra is visible as an attribute, while the other ones hold offerings. I think this is a big incense burner with a long stem. It's not entirely clear from the photograph that is available to me, but in principle, yeah, it occasionally occurs. But it's not very strong, but it occasionally occurs that tantric practitioners are represented, and that is, of course, also the case in the Alchi Sumtsek, where we have, I think, the only case in Alchi where they are represented, and where this tantric practitioner is set aside, essentially, or sits outside the usual monastic assembly. Yeah, has his distinctive dress, lay dress, with a distinctive crown, as we'll see in a minute at the details, and with distinctive references to the deities they refer to. And in this case, not only Vajrasattva, this one, the right one, holds the hands exactly the same way as the deity does, but also Vajradhara. Yeah, and of course, I think the fact that he has the Vajra and bell in the crossed hands, I don't think you find that earlier. And that is, again, it's one of those signs that you can detect in the Alchi Sumtsek that emphasize certain highest Yoga Tantra themes, kind of, or hints towards highest Yoga Tantra themes. And of course, in this particular case, it's probably no accident that this is together with Akshobhya depicted in his paradise. And in the broader scheme of the program of both the Dukang and the Sumtsek, I read Akshobhya's paradise also as a hint towards the highest Yoga Tantra teachings. Yeah, that he gets prominence not because they think the Akshobhya paradise is more important than the Amitabha's paradise, Sukhavati, as it would be because it's represented in the main niche here, but because Akshobhya at the same time is the primary Buddha of the highest Yoga Tantras. And I think it's an, kind of implied in the prominence of Akshobhya within the Alchi monuments. As such, then, towards the late 12th century, a major change in or the fact that then within a especially Kagyu context, among the pupils of Pagmojupa, that the teacher is represented with the clear allusion to the Buddha representation, is a kind of major innovation within the Tibetan tradition. Yeah, and that is kind of very important throughout. A very famous depiction is, of course, this bronze of Pagmojupa in the Cleveland Museum of Art that shows him in, or shows the teacher with Bhumisparsha Mudra in the same frontality as you would represent the Buddha. If you look at the kind of swallow-tailed end on his robe, that's a hint to, Indian Buddha, Northeast Indian Buddha representations. But then there are clear indications in terms of his individuality with the beard, the distinctive facial features that are, and the Tibetan dress that make that kind of clear that it is a Tibetan teacher, in this case Pagmojupa, who is represented here. The idealized eyes, in contrast, again hint, essentially taken from the Buddha depictions. We can't see those as portraits. So it's an element that is taken over from India. And of course, you can also read, what is represented as throne as allusion to the awakening of the Buddha at Bodh Gaya. And this is this is no accident. The Madhis bronze is probably not that early. I would most likely attribute it to a Taklung context and maybe the second half of the 13th century or something like that. Not sure what it says here. Yeah, I luckily wrote that on the slide already. That's my attribution. But it's very clear that within the context of Bhagavad and among his pupils, this idea comes to the fore most prominently for the first time. And in my classes, I always use this particular representation of Buddha Vairocana from the Cleveland Museum of Art, that where this notion of the teacher as an awakened being is kind of topped insofar as here Padma is represented in the crown of Vairocana. Yeah, and this is, to my knowledge, is unique. I still haven't found a second example. It's obviously an extremely bold statement, because for the teacher to be superior to Vairocana, it's definitely a bold statement. And of course, how do we know that it's Bhagmatupa that is represented? It's simply from the lineage, which is the common Kagyu lineage, Vajradhara Tilopa Naropa on one side, and then Marpa Milarepa Gampopa on the other side. And so Bhagmatupa would be the next one, and that would be the usual way you would read lineages, even if in these early paintings it's not always clear. But with Bhagmatupa, we can be fairly sure, I think, simply from the evidence that we have, that his identification or his promotion as an awakened being is predominantly posthumous, at least in terms of the public representation. And I think I have to emphasize here, this does not mean that texts may state that earlier. Yeah, it simply means it wasn't depicted that way. And posthumous in this case also because the disciple, so to speak, is still represented here, not as Sadaka in the corner of the painting, but it's to the side of the lotus of Vairocana. And I think it's no accident that in this particular painting, he is located there because of, Bhagmatupa sitting actually in the crown of the main deity. And so I think this particular representation was probably only possible in that particular context at that time, and later this kind of bold statement of having the teacher quite literally being represented superior to the deity was kind of taken back again. I don't think that was repeated in that form. To be really represented in the crown. At least I don't know any example of that. But then what is clear that among the immediate successors of Bhagavatupa who promoted that notion, especially Taklung Tangpa Chenpo, Tashipel was most often represented frontally very often white-skinned, which I take as a hint towards his identity with Vairocana, and teaching in a kind of configuration that derives from, or that you can take as hinting towards the Buddha depiction. And so there is the clear intention of him kind of being represented as an awakened being. He more frequently, especially among the other schools, but occasionally also among the Taglung, is that the teachers is represented sideways. And I think what that expresses is it's a little more modest, and it expresses that yes, he is an awakened being, but he is it in the succession of, yeah, and it links the representation to the immediate predecessors, like in this kind of abbreviated lineage. You can see Vajradhara, Gampopa, Pakmutupa, and Taklung Tashipel represented. And maybe one of the siddhas, I'm never sure if this is actually hair or if it's a fish on the top of his head in this case, which, yeah, could identify him as Tilopa. But yeah, so you have a kind of abbreviated teaching lineage here, and the fact that he is represented sideways is an indication that it's within the lineage of the oral transmission that the awakening happens. And it's very clear that, like in the early 13th century, around within the Taglung school, but then also within the Drigong school, there's quite some experimentation also within the Karma Kagyu schools then about how to represent the deities and the teacher and his link to deities. Yeah, another kind of direct indication that of the intention to represent the teacher as an awakened being that is equal to the deity is represented through paintings like this one, where you have Taglung Tangpa Chenpo above Chakrasambhara, between his footprints, and everything within the frame of a common lotus throne and a common peacock umbrella. Yeah, so it's very clear that the two central figures are one. Yeah, they're one and the same, and that the feet essentially kind of by extension refer to both, as well as to the tradition of representing the Buddha's footprints and worshipping the Buddha's footprints. And so I think that's, and of course the same then we find in the Karma Kagyu schools as well as in the Drigong school. And with the Drigongs, it's fairly prominent. I think half of the early paintings that we have are footprint paintings rather than teacher paintings. And in the case of this particular painting from the Rubin Museum of Art, that was probably, just placed, folded and placed in the Gao. It's also clear that here, or there is a clear indication that here the original footprints of Drigungpa were applied to. In this case, it would predate 1217, his death in 1217. And I say that there is a clear indication of that simply because the color that was used to make the original or the first footprint that was then outlined and so on, it also dropped on the canvas itself. Yeah, and we still have the drop remaining on the canvas in this case. And so I think, yeah, there are very strong indications that this is of Trikungpa's time. This exceptional painting is extremely important because it also gives us, you know, through the inscription, the entire lineage. It identifies Trikungpa as the last figure in the lineage, just above Chakrasamvara. In between the Guhya Samaja deities, it identifies the specific group of 8 Mahasiddhas to the side of Trikungpa. And it again places the teacher's footprint on the same level as the deity Chakrasamvara. Yeah, and here you are, and on the same throne that is kind of held and flanked by Nagas in this case. And so, needless to say, when I studied Trigung painting, this was a crucial painting because it gives us all the identifications. But there are still some things we don't fully understand, especially this very fragmentary inscription at the bottom still needs to be kind of deciphered more properly. And that it is roughly kind of contemporaneous with, well, not much earlier than the representation in the Tashi-Komang-Cherten in Alchi is indicated also by the Mahasiddhas, and that are represented in especially this unusual triad of Shakyamuni flanked by Nagarjuna and Atisha that is also reflected at Alchi. And it's, you know, this kind of interlinkage that brings the early Trigung paintings together. And of course, on the basis of that, I'll try to, you know, date them and see how Trigung self or representation of Trigung teachers in the 13th century develops. Some of you are certainly familiar with this, but the important point in this connection is really the notions that come with it. So the footprints essentially are another element that identifies the teacher with the Buddha quite directly, and that it is the footprint of the teacher is, especially in the case of Trikungpa, recognizable because his feet are distorted. And that's Catherine Selig-Brown has shown quite nicely. And I think even if you would measure them, you would come to approximately the same size of feet on those. So they are already realistic, or also realistic feet size. And I think in this case, the triple jewel actually stands for Trikungpa as well in this particular example. And of course, you have that then represented in many different ways, as well as with different deities. Many of these early footprint paintings seem to be of the time of the respective main teacher. And it seems to have cross influence across at least the Kagyu schools at that early stage. And if a composition is clearly later, like in the case of this one, where you have 2 additional teachers after Trikungpa, then the footprint is an added one. It's essentially this one, according to the description, the footprint itself is from another canvas pasted onto it, and then it was painted around it. And that explains why in this particular case, this can still be the original footprint of Trikungpa, even if the painting itself is at least, mid 13th century, so about two generations after his death. But again, the important aspect here is the public promotion of the teacher that is communicated through the footprints in association with the footprints of the Buddha. Or if you think of, the Balasena area, you would also have that association in relation to Vishnu, for example. The footprints of Vishnu that were worshipped in those areas as well. And obviously the entire worship of the footprints is a kind of expression of the deference of the disciple to the teacher. Okay, any questions so far? Not really?
Yes, I have
comments. Please.
Yeah, sorry. I've always wondered about these kind of tankas because they're really interesting and kind of, really like historical witnesses. But I'm just wondering what one does make of Chakrasamvara. Is just because it was the tutelary deity of the master, or is there kind of a link or some kind of symbolism linked to that? And the other question would be, do we only have it for these early Kagyu masters or also for in other traditions? Because all of these that we saw were like are early Kagyu masters and teachers. And it seems to me that for these early examples, there are very few, and we only have Kagyu as far as I know, but I don't know if there are any ones that I
don't think we have them for Kadam, definitely not, but they were much more conservative in what they actually depicted and how they promoted themselves. And I don't think we have it for Sakya in that sense at that very same time yet either. Also, the Sakya teachers or the Sakya tradition paintings soon adjusted to that, and teacher representations kind of became increasingly important within that. But I don't think, unless Jörg has another example that he can show, I don't think we have an early one that is as early as the Kagyu ones are. But I think what appears to happen, that the Kagyu idea spread. And then it gets adopted by all the others as well.
Yeah, there are a few later ones that I.
Yeah, exactly.
But these early ones, they all seem to be Kagyu ones, and with Chakrasamvara, probably because it was kind of the tutelary deity of Drinpa.
Yes, I think it was the early tutelary deity, not only of Trigung, but also of the Taglung. And maybe the deity that made them kind of distinctive in a certain way. It's very clear that they emphasize, Chakrasamvara and then by extension Vajrayogini as the main deities. And their representation, to answer your earlier question, together with the teacher is an expression of what I come to next, is the concept of guru yoga, essentially, that you practice the deity in the shape of your teacher. And so that the teacher and the deity are the same. And I think that's expressed in these.
Mm-hmm.
And
so in a way, it also comes back to that idea of the Tantric practitioner who is depicted with the same attributes and the same postures of the deities that we saw before, right? With the
Yes, except with the change that now it's the teacher who takes precedence. And of course, you have to imagine at the same time, the triadic composition comes about, that you have the teacher lineage above, the main subject in the center, and the protectors below. And so this Guru Yidam Chogyong composition is, again, it's part of this entire package. Yeah. Yeah, Jörg, please.
Just to quickly add, yeah, I think we don't have surviving examples from Sakya, but I think we have written references. For instance, we have that description Lovo Kenshin wrote of a tanka showing Sachen that was commissioned by Sachen's son, Chakvagyal. And then we would also be in 12th century, but it seems not to have survived. But we have a full written description of how that painting looked like.
Yeah, thanks. That's great to know. But you know, I'm not a textual person, and I think sometimes, especially, you know, when I look at the relationship of Trigung texts and what they attribute, whatever, to Trigungpa himself or immediate successors by text, that doesn't completely match up with the material evidence. So I'm sometimes yeah, I'm a little more skeptical in that respect, that it all existed that way, or maybe it existed, but it probably wasn't as early as maybe the text implies. That's the most likely scenario here. But unfortunately, we don't have any. But I think it should be fairly soon that the Sakya just take that over as well. Yeah, it wouldn't be.
Yeah. I mean, what speaks for Lovo Kenshin's description is we have also descriptions by Lovo Kenshin of other paintings he saw which survive, and then we see that what he described is very accurate, and so that speaks for him that also the Sachin portrayal might actually have been one commissioned by Sachin's son. But as you say, until it pops up, we can't say 100% that is the case.
Yeah, but I fully believe that Ngorchen saw it. It's just a question, was it as early?
Yeah, so Lovo Kenshin, not Ngorchen.
Lovo Kenshin, sorry. Yeah. That Lovo Kenshin saw it, yes.
Yeah, it's what he says, it was commissioned by his son, but whether that's the truth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Luis?
Hi. So just a minor point, because you mentioned that the deities with the Vajra and the bell, and also the their kind of disciples also having the same kind of accoutrements. Do you get the sense in these early pictures that they're using Vajras and bells that are in practice, used in the rituals, or are they using a kind of an Indic model from iconography? I'm kind of interested in the shapes of these things and whether they kind of change over time.
But the problem is the depiction of these are not, you know, that detailed that you could say that, but I would assume that these are simply ritual implements that they used, or at least it implies that. Yeah.
So if it's a deity that's holding that, then it wouldn't have been that they'd necessarily copied an Indic model for that. They might have just used what was lying around. I'm
not sure if I understand.
Oh, sorry. So if you have a deity who's holding a bell and a Vajra, and they want to depict that, would they?
Yeah, no, I think,
or would they have used real?
I think as we see Vajra and bell, or the notion, I think there are two things coming together, and you can check out the article of Rob and Gina Kim in this respect. But I think what comes together is Vajrasattva, or the practitioner representing Vajrasattva as both as deity, but also the primary symbol for Tantric Buddhism in principle, because, you know, even in the Yoga Tantra, it's Vajrasattva who asks. and then with the highest Yoga Tantra, the Vajra holding deity is the important one. And so it's no accident that in Alchi you have both Vajradhara, Vajrasattva represented through the hand gestures of the teachers. And so I think it has to do more with that. That becomes the primary. And obviously, Vajra and Bell become or are the primary kind of ritual implements of esoteric Buddhist practitioners. And I think in that sense, they become depicted as Vajrasattva. And it may well be linked to, you know, the Yoga Tantras and Yoga Tantra practices and Yoga Tantra texts that emphasize Vajrasattva's role within it. Because I think that would explain why they also are often linked with the 5 Buddha crown and the ribbons that are also represented with them. And so that then just continues on, but gets reinterpreted within the highest Yoga Tantra context.
Okay.
And so you have the same Vajra and bell holding deity, practitioner with, you know, Shadakshara Lokeshvara, or Vajrasattva himself, or the Vajradhatu Mandala. Yeah, so you have it with different main deities. So it's not necessarily this association with the main deity. That is really that you identify a self that's more for the visualization itself, less for the ritual.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Welcome.
And there is also a question in the chat, but I think you answered them, in fact, last week, because Cecile asked, why are the Drikung so much represented in Alchi? So I don't know. I don't know if you want to give us.
Yeah. I can answer that again. In principle, only because Tsultim Ö, the founder of the Sumtsek and the what I now call the Baldentrebungschirten, the Great Stupa, he was a follower of Trigongpa. And that's why he is represented there. And the 3 monuments are probably built within 10 years, like from the Sumtsek to the small stupa maximum, I guess. And so I think it's all in his context, probably during his lifetime. And in my hypothesis for the Sumtsek is that it actually was built to house a shrine of Trigongpa's relics, which essentially indicates that Tsultim was kind of prominent enough among the followers to actually get some relics that he can build a shrine around. But that's what the inscription implies. And so I guess, but I think what it doesn't mean is that Alchi at that time was a Drikung monastery. It's a family monastery that was run by the family who followed the prominent teacher of the time. And that especially in the Western Himalayas were the Drikung at that time with their big hermitages in you know, these big groups that went to Mount Kailash, of which we have the records of. Yeah. So I hope that answers that.
Christian?
Yeah.
It's Niels. Hi. I have a question too regarding the painting of Drikungpa and Chakrasamvara that you showed before from the Rabin Museum. You said that the footprints were added at a later time. I did not understand whether, not this one.
Not, oh, this one, yeah.
And I was wondering whether you meant that the whole Tanka was made after the death of Drigungpa, long after that, and
No,
it was composed in a single time, or were the footprints added later separately?
The footprints are cut out of an older object and pasted on the canvas, and then it was painted around it.
Okay. But it was certainly, the Tanka was certainly composed with this idea to add the footprints.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was composed with that idea, but it clearly is later in composition. But the footprints themselves, they probably came from a simpler piece like this on very thin canvas, and then were just reused.
Okay. And that links to my second question. There are a lot of sketch paintings from the early Drigung period, like the one that you showed just before.
Yeah.
And why is that? I mean, was there a trend to have these simple ink drawings made instead of actual paintings, or were there sketches that were supposed to be painted at some point?
I think it must have to do with practice, and I think it's no accident that on this one, as well as on this one, we see the folds from or the lines from previously folding. And so I think they weren't meant to be paintings or art at all. They were probably just produced to be amulets, or not amulets, maybe just in a gao, as part of your daily, or maybe even just relics in a way. Touch relics of Drigungpa that you essentially need for your practice. Okay. And so I wouldn't be surprised if those who went to the Western Himalayas all had one of these with them from their teacher, for example. And so I wouldn't see them as artworks as such at all.
Okay, because they are as elaborate as the paintings. I mean,
they're as elaborate, but as you say, they don't paint it.
Yeah, so they were less expensive to produce.
And they are much easier to produce. They're much quicker to produce. And obviously they were thought to be sufficiently, embellished for the footprints to be a good context for the footprints. And that may be the reason why they drew around it at the first place and just didn't take, a textile with the footprint only. That it needed some context.
Okay.
That would be my assumption in this case. Yeah.
It seems like a construct. Sorry, it seems like a reliquary for the relics. It's like putting one puts the relics into a kind of frame or elaborate frame. Sometimes it's just decorations, right? And this seems like something very similar, but just because otherwise it's not the fact that these are precious relics and not just this kind of piece of bone. It's not really, celebrated. And this would be the same case, right? It's otherwise, it's not clear that this is a sacred object, but probably it was also much less expensive to produce because one didn't need the pigments for all the colors and stuff.
Yeah, but they still were good painters. The drawing is very nice on these. Yeah, but yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you, Christian.
Thanks.
I would have a question.
Oh yes, please.
Hello, Christian.
Hi, good seeing you.
Yeah, good to see you. I missed your former conference, but I won't miss the next one, and I'll get hopefully the recordings. You just mentioned records of the Drigungpas at Mount Kailash, and I wanted to know which records you were referring to.
Records?
Yes.
No, I just meant that there are the groups of Drigung who went to Mount Kailash, not that we have records of groups of Drigung in the historical writings.
You mean the Chöjung, or some biographies?
Yeah, in the biographies, I think mostly that's where it's mentioned, especially what is his name, Sherab Chungne, the immediate disciple who went to Kailash with a group, and yeah.
Yes, there is quite a detailed story in the Neyik, in the pilgrimage guidebook to Mount Kailash, but they are much later stories.
Yeah. Yes, there are later stories as well, but we also have the confirmation of, you know, some textual sources dating to the early 13th century with local kings from the region meeting the Drigong monks at the hermitages and so on. So I think it fits together quite nicely.
Yes, it does. Which text from the local kings? What?
No, like the what Philibek published, the These account.
I'm not
aware. I can send you the reference after.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So with that, I'll continue with the. So part of I already mentioned part of the representation has to do with Guru Yoga. And of course, Guru Yoga only really makes sense if you see the teacher as an awakened being, and if he is identical with the deity. And that, I think, is expressed wonderfully in this particular painting from Taklung Tangpa Chenpo, where you have Taklungpa represented within the temple of Bodh Gaya, flanked by two Bodhisattvas. When we kind of look more closely at them, they are Vajrasattva on one side with Vajra and Bell, and probably Manjushri on the other with the Utpala. He is clearly seen in the tradition of a teacher, and he is represented multiple times, as is frequently the case with Taklung Tangpa. And you have at the bottom the sadhaka. But obviously this composition orients itself on representations or contemporaneous representations of Buddha Shakyamuni within the temple of Bodh Gaya. Yeah, here with the scenes of the life of the Buddha. But if you just take the central composition and add the 7 Buddhas of the past and Maitreya, yeah, you get to the composition that is used for Taklung Tangpa. And if so that essentially explains why they are represented in the upper part of the painting. Here we'll have the flanking bodhisattvas that, of course, indicate or hint of as Taklung Tangpa being a Tantric practitioner with Vajrasattva, and the wisdom element with Manjushri. And then in addition, you have the practitioner in the bottom corner of the painting, but seated opposite a Buddha with Bhumisparsha Mudra that clearly again hints towards the Buddha at Bodh Gaya. Yeah, and in this case we can say that because his bodily proportions are slightly off. Like if we look at him, his head is too big for the body and he has no neck. And this is the so-called short-necked Buddha that at one stage occupied the temple at Bodh Gaya, the temple of awakening, and that is replicated in many early works up to the Buddha representation in the Kumbum at Gyantse. Yeah, you can still see the resonance of this particular Buddha type that is represented there. And so what quite literally happens in this painting then is the switch between Taglung Tangpa and the Buddha. And so what you quite literally can see in this triad or triangle at the bottom, if I go back to this one, is that the practitioner here essentially imagines Taglung Tangpa instead of the Buddha within the temple. Yeah. And so it's probably the most kind of explicit or one of the most explicit representations in that respect, besides the ones that we have seen before, where the teacher shares the place with the deity. Yeah. And of course, part of what that composition and the one in Bodh Gaya also implies is the notion that, you know, once not only is the teacher an awakened being, but since you can practice the deity only with the help of the teacher, he is also more important. Yeah. And this notion, I don't think there is evidence that it was promoted in the same way in India, for example, that the teacher is more important than the deity itself, and that it was implemented visually in the promotion or in the representation within different Buddhist schools in India in that way. Yeah, but here it's very clear, it's always the teacher sits above and the deity sits below. Yeah, and it's not only that switch is indicated, but it's also there's this clear hierarchy in the sense that is implied in that as well. And so I think again it's fairly explicit, and I date this particular painting, yeah, rather to an earlier period, rather to the early 13th century, because yeah, for both stylistic reasons, but also for reasons of the painting only really making sense close to the lifetime of Taglung Tangpa Chenpo. Yeah, because I think in a later period, you wouldn't necessarily kind of represent the relationship of teacher and disciple that way. What is very difficult to say with all paintings in general is, you know, is it still painted during the lifetime or after the lifetime of the respective main teacher? Yeah, or is it commemorative, or is it all done during the lifetime? We have indications in both directions. Obviously, the footprint paintings, they must have been done during the lifetime. And so there is an indication of that. But obviously, we have also equally many indications that artworks were kind of commissioned commemorative. Yeah, or to fulfill the intention of the teacher or something like that. And so I think both possibilities, there's still a certain kind of uncertainty in terms of dating the artworks that depict such subjects, and I don't think we can really overcome that unless the inscriptions give us a clear indication. Yeah, but I would kind of hypothetically always go rather towards the end of that teacher's life in any case. Obviously, the more famous he became historically, the more likely it is that such representations are made. Okay, the this kind of association of teacher and Buddha, of course, is then carried further in many ways in the Tibetan tradition. And one wonderful early example I often talk about, but never finished to write about, is this one, again, Pagmotupa, with in a context of the Taklung school that is extremely, it's a very small painting, it's just A4 size, very detailed, very well preserved, and it depicts the teacher in an elaborate context that is also explained through the inscriptions at the back. And here the inscriptions at the back essentially help us not only to give it a historical context, but also to see it in the broader picture of how the teacher is perceived. And of course, now we moved into the 1270s, that is second half of the 13th century, specifically within the Taklung school, and it builds on those earlier notions. And I said earlier that it's mostly Taklung Tangpa Chenpo himself who is represented frontally, while most other teachers' representations show them in sideways. And in this case, the teacher is again shown sideways, but he performs some variant of the teaching gesture. And I think the sideways posture is again because he is seen in succession of Gampopa, in this case clearly identifiable through his gray hair. That's one of the nicknames, was kind of gray-haired for Gampopa, and that is often indicated on early paintings. So again, it's an now extremely abbreviated lineage within which Pagmotupa is seen. The esoteric teachings are placed above. Also, the exoteric and esoteric Buddha, Shakyamuni and Akshobhya, left and right. So the actual transmitted teachings are represented above. And then to the side of it, you actually have figures of different types, Mahasiddhas, Buddhas, and kings that are represented. And it's only the inscriptions on the back that actually clarify the connection between those. Yeah. And if we make the back transparent, we can see that in this case, the front and the back completely align, and that we have a representation of a stupa on the back as the main composition, made up. There is a yellow outline of the stupa itself, but it's hard to recognize here. And otherwise it's just covered in writing that is co-equal with the teacher on the front. And for each of the other deities, you have both the Purification Mantra and then specific mantras related to the deities on the front that are drawn on the back as well. So if we'll zoom in, we'll see the Purification Mantra, Om Ahum, everywhere on the back of the forehead, the neck, and the heart. And then we see that for each and every kind of main figure in the painting. And along with the mantras that include the mantra that specifically refers to Pagmotupa, namely Oma Namo Guru Ratna Vajra Raja Hum. And so that's typical for the Taklung, that they build essentially the ordination name of the respective teacher into the mantra, and in Sanskrit form usually. And so, but this name is not only found once at the back of the main figure, but it is also found everywhere underneath the Buddhas, on the back of the side vignettes, as well along the bottom of the painting. Yeah, which of course indicates to us that all these also represent Bhagavadopa, as do all the main figures at the bottom. And the only way you can really explain that is that the side figures, they represent different previous lives of Bhagavadopa, and the bottom represent episodes of the last life of Bhagavadopa, in specifically in relationship to Taklung Tangpa Chenpo, who is represented as secondary figures in many of the depictions. And so it's only the descriptions on this particular tanka that actually allow us to identify those and indicate that all of them represent the same teacher. And of course, what that reminds us immediately is that the teacher itself is seen similar to the Buddha, with his previous lives and with the last life, and everything together on one painting. And so here, not only, you know, the way the teacher is represented is associated directly with the Buddha, but his entire life is constructed along the model of the Buddha. And this is, of course, clearly a development that goes hand in hand. You have to, with the, you know, the first incarnation lineage, or the idea for the first incarnation lineage within the Karma-Kagyu school. And it kind of parallels that. And in a certain way, I think the idea of, or the notion of the teacher as a Buddha was decisive in creating that association, and then moving on from that, enabling the notion of reincarnation and using the notion of reincarnation in different ways, especially within the Kagyu schools, to link to the past, to link to India, and so on. Yeah, and I think that is all is an important aspect that is documented in this particular painting. What is also important in this particular painting is that through, you know, his representation in the front in form of his body, the representation on the back in form of the mantra, and in form of the stupa overall that aligns with the body of the teacher himself is represented in three different forms: body, speech, and mind. Yeah, as a deity would be. And that again becomes a common feature within Tibetan painting later on. And also that the painting itself, of course, is by extension to be seen quite literally as the body of the, not only the body of the teacher, but a higher manifestation in a certain way of the teacher. Yeah, not only the representation of his body, but also of his speech and mind. That is, and so I think that kind of makes Tibetan paintings extremely interesting, that you have this interplay. And obviously this painting then can be analyzed further, and it contains many notions from, from the awakened being, through the previous lives, through the last life, and through the different levels of subtlety of his body that are represented within it. And you can even read the mantras at the back as a kind of progression towards Buddhahood, with essentially a prayer never to be separated across many lives from the teacher, being a foundation, mantras of worship to different deities as kind of one form of practice, the actual consecration of the teacher or the practitioner in this case, the lineage or the perception of the teacher within its lineage, and the attainment of awakening, that are all represented on the painting in the form of the scriptures on the back. I'll see there are several questions in the chat, but I only see that now. Did you mention how this tanka is dated to circa 1270? No, I didn't. We can do that. For that, we'll have to go back to, let's go back to this one. No, maybe this one is the best. So the painting most likely dates to the 1270s for a number of reasons. On the one hand, there is, in addition to, sadly I didn't bring that, but I could open it. But in addition to the mantra directly referring to Padma, you have a succession of mantras dedicated to different teachers. I think the last one being, let's see. So here starts the Dharma. So this down here is the last teacher, and it says Ratna Prajna Guru Hum. And Prajna Guru, I think that's the second or third. I'm not entirely sure, but you have successive teachers of Taglung abbots. Yeah. And obviously it can't precede the last one. Again, we don't know, was he still alive? Was he not alive anymore? But you can, all these Taglung paintings have actually the full succession of teachers up to the time the painting was made on the back. And then in addition, on this particular painting, you have an additional inscription at the top, which is later, that essentially refers to, or says Taglung Pa Önpo Lama Rinpoche Palgirapne Shuk, so that it contains the consecration of Önpo. And Önpo is the Taglung teacher who in 1272 went or left the abbotship of Taglung at the conflict, after a conflict, and moved to Rinpoche and founded Rinpoche Monastery there. And my assumption is that these kind of reconsecrations that he had marked at the very top of the painting here were necessary because he took many of the treasures from Taklung, in conflict, so to speak, with him, and that is recorded even in the Blue Annals, for example. The story is recorded, and since that happened, on one hand, happened in 1272. On the other hand, the teacher, the last teacher, I think, is his immediate predecessor. So there is very little space left in terms of where to date this particular painting. Yeah. But my assumption is that most of those that contain this reconsecration inscription are objects that he took from Taklung to Rinpoche. I hope that was clear.
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the last point then I wanted to make in this is essentially that this essentially prepares the space for reincarnation within a Tibetan context. And of course, the earliest reincarnation lineage is that of the Karmapa, and obviously paintings like this one, where you have two Karmapas represented, indicate that that happened at a fairly early stage already. And that, kind of fits quite perfectly into this overall picture that the Trigulung and Taklung paintings give us. They just didn't take this step of using reincarnation as a means of transmitting the tradition from one to another, but in this case, the abbotship was inherited by by prominent teachers within their respective tradition. But then, as we know, this becomes a kind of standard feature in many schools across Tibetan Buddhism later on, especially when the link to families, between families and monasteries, kind of got increasingly severed in later history. And it also represents a model for all later teacher perceptions, not only within the Kagyu schools, but within the Sakya school, but also even within the Nyingma school. And I don't think it's accidentally. I didn't bring examples that at this very same time, when these teacher representations became prominent within the new schools, the Nyingma school, or not sure if it's only Nyingma school, but Padmasambhava representations emerged. I don't think we have a representation of Padmasambhava that predates the 13th century. And I think it emerged as a kind of counter to the narrative of the direct transmission of teachings from India through Mahasiddhas and the different Kagyu traditions as the only way of authentication or authentication of Tibetan teachings. So I think the Padmasambhava, or tracing one's teachings back to Padmasambhava, was one genius way around that. And I think that had partially, I think it's a reaction to the prominence of the teacher within the Kagyu schools. And obviously then these notions influence everything we know about Tibetan art from then onwards. And I think representations like of Tsongkhapa, together with his life in that form, wouldn't be thinkable without that earlier development and the notion of the teacher as an awakened being within the Kagyu traditions more broadly. And so what changes, of course, or what varies within the different traditions is what is the teacher associated with, or what is communicated through the respective teacher representation. Like, is he associated with Manjushri, like Tsongkhapa is he characterized as Tantric Practitioner with Vajra and Bell and so on? So I think the qualities that they are represented with change, but otherwise it's kind of the standard, or what has been established in the Kagyu schools earlier becomes a kind of standard feature for Tibetan paintings later on. Here, another example to lead back to Paris with this kind of central painting of the 5th Dalai Lama from a set with his reincarnation lineage and handprints and footprints. And I'm not entirely sure in this case, but as far as I remember, I think the handprints and footprints are or handprints may be possible, but the footprints are definitely too small to be the real ones here. And so here they are kind of more symbolic, and they are not only added to the main painting in this set, but to all these other paintings of the same set that show the previous incarnations of the Dalai Lama. Yeah, and obviously they can only be, it's not, the handprints of footprints of each of the previous incarnations, but I think one has to see them as extensions of the same 5th Dalai Lama's handprints and footprints, but some of you may be of a different opinion in that respect. And yeah, that would be I think I'm a little too fast today, but that's the topic that I'll focus in the last lecture then, is this kind of the notion of sets and the different ways to read them. And maybe I can come back to this one, which of course is not complete, so it's more difficult to talk about in this case. So I think that's overall what I wanted to present. And the main point is, of course, that there is a big break in the late 12th century, early 13th century. And I think that break is also visible in the sense, for example, of the literature of teaching lineages being described. That's the so-called topics. That you see it in the literature as well, that the conception changes in that time, and that this became a very, very influential part of the Tibetan tradition.